From NJ.com, this is Talk is Cheap, a New York Giants podcast. We're talking Big Blue football all year round.
What's going on, everybody? Zack, Rosenblatt here for the latest episode of the Talk is Cheap podcast. I'm here with Darryl, Slater. The Giants are coming off a win, which they've only done one other time this year. They beat Washington, which is the only team it seems like they're capable of beating. What's like the ratio with Daniel Jones starts of Washington wins to not? I think you wrote something about that.
Daniel Jones he's 4-0 against Washington, and he's 1-16 in his other starts.
It's unreal.
Which seems almost impossible.
Yeah,
it's a weird little statistical quirk, and I think the Giants, the number I put out there, they're 6-2 against Washington since the start of the 2017 season, and they're 8-41 in their other games. So they've been
it's
bad
absolutely
overall.
bonkers.
Yeah, they've been bad overall, but pretty good against Washington. So,
and the irony is Washington has had like more overall success in that like long stretch, and
right.
But the Giants, just for whatever reason, have their number. It's like so crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's not like they've been a really good team, but
no. But more success than the Giants.
Yeah, low bar to clear, but they've cleared it.
Yeah. But yeah, so the Giants won another close one because, as you and I joke every week, we'd like to just get like one blowout in either direction. It looked like maybe the Giants were heading that way, and then they let Washington come back into it. But it was another close one. They've had, like 4 straight close games. And it's, that this week they play the Eagles, which I imagine will be another one like that because whenever they play the Eagles, there's always some weird stuff that happens. Usually where the Giants are leading most of the game, then they blow it at the end. But we'll see how that goes. But So I like to ask this each week, like what you walk out of? I mean, we weren't at the game because it was in Landover, and we didn't. I'm not mad about not being in Landover, by the way. But what'd you think at the end of that game when they pulled out that win?
Yeah, I mean, obviously another kind of head-spinning finish, but a team learning how to win and learning how to finish off games. And I know Joe Judge always downplays that idea of learning how to win and closing out in the late moments. But the reality is certain moments in the game are obviously more important than others. There's higher pressure moments, obviously. People are human playing the game, It's not like they're robots and every moment is exactly the same. So in a high-pressure moment, the Giants were able to finish, got picks in the last 2 Washington drives. And really, I mean, going into that game, the Giants had blown fourth quarter leads and lost in 3 of their previous 4 games, and it could have been 4 if Washington had not gone for 2, tied the game, and then say they had won in overtime. That would have been 4 straight fourth quarter blown leads going into the game, and then potentially it would have been 5. So
Yeah.
if they had blown that lead and lost in Washington on Sunday, that would have been their worst loss of the season, no doubt, considering they had a 20-3 lead, and basically blew it almost. And
I mean, watching that every chance at the end to come back, and they kept turning the ball over. So
right, and obviously Alex Smith, it would have been a great story, from just an objective standpoint if he was able to kind of finish that off. But you got a guy who's barely played since 2018, so he's obviously going to be rusty. So it'll be interesting to see what he does the rest of the year for them because it's his show now with Kyle Allen out. That's sort of what I walked away from that game with is obviously 2 really flawed teams, and the Giants, are trying to find their way, and they're trying to be a team that can close out these type of games. And they were able to do it. Now let's see going forward if they can kind of carry this and make it mean anything. Because they do have some winnable games on the schedule. They play the Cowboys still, and they play the Bengals still. And the narrative here in the final 7 games is going to be, can they do enough to save Dave Gettleman's job? They're going to have to close out some of these games that are winnable.
Yeah, and just kind of like running through some takeaways I had coming out of that game, and you can feel free if any of these like catch your eye that you want to elaborate on or whatever. But a few things that kind of I thought of leaving this game was, number one, Daniel Jones finally didn't turn the ball over, and that's probably it's not why they won, but it's why they won because he's lost games for them that were closer than this, where he turned the ball over. Number 2, I would say Patrick Graham. I think we've talked about him on the spot a lot, but he just deserves like so much credit for the work he's done. I think he had a masterclass in that game. The game-winning interception that Logan Ryan had was a play that they installed on Saturday morning, which by all accounts from all the coaches and the players, that's not really something that's pretty common. At least not one that like winds up winning the game for you. And Patrick Graham, like they're at the middle of the pack in the league, which is a major step up from what they were last year in most categories. They're, I think, like number 3 rush defense on Pro Football Focus. And they're doing it without a good second cornerback or great pass rushers. So I think that's something worth hyping up. And Leonard Williams, I think, deserves a lot of credit. And maybe we should get into Leonard Williams because I think that's a topic that fans like hearing about, just because like the controversy around that trade. But he's been really good. He was really good in that game. He has 5 sacks this year. In terms of the bad, Isaac Yiadom, I think Pro Football Focus had him giving up 158.3 passer rating, which is a perfect rating. And you could see that they were targeting him a lot more than they were targeting James Bradberry on that 68-yard Terry McLaurin touchdown. He was right there, and he like just haphazardly tried tackling him. So Terry McLaurin easily got away, and he scored, and that could have been the difference in the game. And they don't have any other options at that spot, so he's going to keep starting, which is alarming. And if you just look at like the history of their number 2 cornerback spot, it's like really scary stuff over the last few years. But there's that, and then you have the offensive line. I think had probably its best game of the year. But which of those things like do you want to talk about? Because I think those are all worthy combos.
Well, I think Daniel Jones is obviously the most important
Yeah.
thing. That's a huge point of progress for him to not turn the ball over. I mean, that is priority number 1, 2, and 3 for him this year and going into the year, and it became even more of an issue. We talked about all the stats going into this game about how he was on pace for 26 turnovers and what a disaster it would be if he potentially had 50 turnovers through 2 years. And that was the narrative. Again, he was playing a really good defense, remember, too. I mean, they were the 4th-ranked DVOA defense going into that game, Washington was. And that was a nice job by him. He obviously has to go out and play the Eagles and do it in the second straight week here coming up. But I think that's progress for Daniel Jones, and that's what the Giants want to see. They want to see a quarterback who can play smart and play safe at times and not always be so risky. And that's been we talked to you and I, a bunch of people about this, and that's been a big hurdle for him. So I think this was an important lesson game for him. In terms of the other stuff you mentioned, I think the other biggest picture thing on the other side of the ball is just defensively how well they're playing, given their limitations. And not just that, I think you don't overlook the fact that Leonard Williams has a lot of potential, or at least people thought he did. And he is obviously a physically gifted guy who was drafted 6th overall, who's never really been able to put it together. So maybe there's something that Patrick Graham and Sean Spencer are doing to really bring out the best in him. So I think not only does Patrick Graham deserve credit for putting together an overall relatively successful defense, given his limitations, but I think he also deserves credit, and Sean Spencer too, for getting the more out of a guy who doesn't objectively stink. Like, I mean, obviously some of these guys in this defense are not good players, and they're getting something out of them, but they're also drawing a little bit of this, what didn't seem like it was ever going to appear out of Leonard Williams. So I think that's the flip side to what they've done defensively.
And I mean, you covered Leonard Williams for like all of the beginning of his career pretty much, right? So like what was the issue with him? Was it an effort thing? Was it he was just not living up to his talent? Like what'd you make of, because he had that one year where he was a Pro Bowler in 2016, I believe it was. He had 7 sacks, and then you kind of didn't hear from him for a few years.
Yeah, he was never able to finish sacks. I mean, he wasn't quick enough off the ball, and he talked about all these things every year. You'd come back to Florham Park and talk about these things that he had done in the offseason to improve his quick twitch and improve his ability off the ball, and the guys he had worked with in the offseason, and how this was going to be the year that he was going to convert all the quarterback hits to sacks. And the stats are really insane. I know it off the top of my head because I wrote it the other night. In his first 79 career games, he had 17 and a half sacks. And the number of quarterback hits, I have to look it up, but it was way above that. So he had been a somewhat effective pass rusher, and he'd been good against the run, but he hadn't been able to finish off sacks. And this year, 5 sacks in 9 games. So you don't have to be a math major to figure out that that's kind of crazy. I mean, he almost has a third of his previous sack total here in 9 games that he had in his first 79. So yeah, I think he's playing on a defensive line, and you could say, oh, he's playing on a defensive line that has some threats on him. But you got to remember, earlier in his career, he was playing on a pretty good defensive line too, that had Damon Harrison and that had Sheldon Richardson. So obviously, those guys kind of went in different directions in terms of them not, they were not dominant players, or at least certainly not any longer. But at the time, he played against guys who got attention. But then the storyline became the double teams he was drawing with the Jets. So whatever it is that Sean Spencer and Patrick Graham are doing, they deserve a lot of credit for it.
It's such like a complex discussion with Leonard Williams, just because, you have to kind of talk about all the baggage that comes with it. Like, I wrote the day after the game about Leonard Williams, and I got a lot of people agreeing, some pushback on the context of it, because I think, it comes back, this trade that Dave Gettleman did is going to be kind of like, it seems like it's gotten more pub than even the Odell Beckham trade to this point, probably because I think people have just moved on from that, and maybe Dexter Lawrence is good, maybe Drabil has some talent, whatever. With the Leonard Williams one, I still believe, even if, the whole point, even if he is great this year, which he has been so far, it still was not a smart trade at the time. Like, you could still say that. If you just look at everything that happened, they traded a 3rd and a 5th round pick for a guy that the Jets were more than willing to trade. I'm sure Joe Douglas said yes before Dave Gettleman finished the offer. And so they traded a 3rd, and it could have been a 4th. It wound up being a 5th. And then they franchise tagged Leonard Williams for $16.1 million, which almost underscored the problem to begin with, which is you could have signed him as a free agent, and if you had offered him $16 million as a free agent, you would have gotten him in a second, because nobody else was going to pay Leonard Williams that, coming off of a 0.5 sack season. So the trade itself, I still don't think was a good move. One of Dave Gettleman's worst moves, if you just look at the logic of it. But at the same time, he's played like a Pro Bowler this year, and that's what they're paying him to do. And if he keeps doing this, then that's great. And then you also kind of have to think about the future. Like, what does this mean? So his value is only skyrocketing now because he knows, he's hamstringing the Giants by the fact that they felt the need to franchise tag him in the first place. And then he's not living up to that necessarily, but he's playing really well. So they're going to have to pay him a lot this offseason if they want to bring him back. And if you bring him back, you're probably not going to be able to pay Dalvin Tomlinson also, or Logan Ryan. So it's just like such an interesting, conversation to have, because on one hand, he's one of their most important players. On the other hand, they should never have traded for him.
It's fascinating because, this is the ultimate case of a guy really turning it on in a contract year. I'm looking at his numbers now. He had 3 sacks as a rookie in 2015, then 7, and then he went 2, 5, and 0.5 in terms of his sacks the next 3 years. So he had 7 sacks in 2016, and then he had 7.5 combined in the next 3 seasons. So he really tailed off. And last year, he only had 16 quarterback hits, too. So, you look at his quarterback hits his first 4 years, 21, 19, 25, 20, and that dips down to 16 last year. Pretty much on pace for the low 20s this year in that department. But obviously, with the 5 sacks, it makes up for that. So he was a guy who was never able to finish on quarterback hits. So that number I kind of teased earlier, he had 101 quarterback hits and 17.5 sacks in his first 5 seasons.
Crazy, yeah.
It doesn't make sense. It just doesn't make sense. How is that even possible to get to the quarterback, to get close that often, and to not be able to finish off sacks? And obviously he's quicker this year. They're doing more to help him get off the ball. Obviously he's not jumping the snap count every time. Otherwise he'd be getting penalized a lot more than he has. I don't even know if he has much at all. But look, here's the bottom line. It's a blessing and a curse that he's playing well, isn't it? Because, like you said, it makes the decision next offseason a lot harder. And what happens if there's a new GM? How much stock? He's not going to have to be loyal to the fact that Dave Gettleman traded for Leonard Williams. But, then that makes it, you let him walk and he gets paid big by somebody else to go elsewhere. And maybe that winds up being the quote-unquote smart move, because the worst possible thing you could do in this situation is double down. Double down on a mistake just because Leonard Williams had a pretty good year this year. You have to look at what type of player he's going to be going forward. You can't pay off just 1 year. That's not how it works. And this guy's going to be 27 next year, so he's still young. He has that on his side. He's coming off a productive year. Maybe he has turned it around and turned it on now in this contract here. But again, it just seems like a dicey situation, because you could very easily overpay for a guy who goes right back basically into being an average player next year potentially.
And that's going to be another one of their dilemmas, because, that on one hand, this defensive line is probably the strength of this team, but also, do you really want to pay 2 probably, I mean, Leonard Williams, his best strength is probably I don't know. He's a little more well-rounded than Dalvin Tomlinson. Dalvin Tomlinson's a run-stopping nose tackle. And so if you're paying both those guys a lot of money, you're kind of making it harder to go and get an edge rusher that can be dominant, which is a more valuable commodity than what they are. And they don't really have anyone on this team right now that's, a good enough edge rusher that you can say will be a 10-sack guy at some point. So I think that's a very interesting point. And it's going to be I'm very curious to see how that plays out. And, a lot of it will have to do if Dave Gettleman is the GM or if somebody else is, because if it's Gettleman, he's going to do everything he can to bring Leonard back because he loves that guy and he's kind of tied his future to him almost. But if it's somebody else, who knows what they'll think. But that kind of makes me think about the next thing I want to talk about, which is I would say this team's biggest weakness right now, especially since the offensive line at least has shown flashes of being capable of like being good, although I'm not sure they're good enough to sustain how they played against Washington against a better Eagles team. But that number 2 cornerback spot is just a serious problem. I have something coming out about this. By the time this podcast is up, it'll be out. Where if you just look at like what their number 2 cornerback has looked like since the year before Dave Gettleman got here. Like here, let me pull up the list right now. So in 2017, 18, and 19, Janoris Jenkins was the number 1 corner, and he was relatively fine. He wasn't perfect by any stretch, but he was fine. And the number 2 cornerbacks were in 2017, Ross Cockrell, Eli Apple, and Brandon Dixon, your friend from the Jets. 2018 was Eli Apple and B.W. Webb. 2019 it was DeAndre Baker, Sam Beal, and Antonio Hamilton. And so far this year with James Bradbury, who's been amazing, has been Corey Ballantyne, Isaac Yiadom, and Ryan Lewis, who those 3 guys you've heard of Corey Ballantyne, but you never heard of the other 2 before this year. Like the fact that they were supposed to have DeAndre Baker and Sam Beal this year. I'm not sure you could have been all that confident in those guys, maybe more than who they have, but like that it's just so easy for the offense, the quarterback, especially if they're a quarterback smart enough and they're a veteran and they're talented. You just target whoever's not James Bradbury and you're going to succeed probably.
That's crazy. I mean, it's been really a cursed spot. I wonder, and I don't know if you looked this up for your story. When's the last time they had a pretty good number 2 cornerback? You might have to go back.
Yeah, I would have to go back before 2017 for sure.
Yeah, I mean, and just see. I mean, but I'm sure people listening would probably know better than we would because they've been paying attention to the team longer. But just from, I think if you just talk about the current state of the Giants, which maybe they had a productive guy in 2014 or whatever, it doesn't really matter one bit for the current team. But to be that unproductive for that long at that spot, I mean, that's obviously your number 2 cornerback is going to be number 2 for a reason. But imagine if DeAndre Baker had turned out all right, and they had been able to say replace Janoris Jenkins with James Bradbury this offseason. That would have been a nice pairing if DeAndre Baker had lived up to his draft status, but obviously that didn't happen last year, and it didn't happen this offseason in terms of stuff on and off the field. So here they are again. I mean, you have to say that this is probably their worst number 2 cornerback situation of all those years, 17, 18,
yeah,
19.
Absolutely.
Even with as bad as DeAndre Baker was. But I'd be curious to know, maybe his PFF grade was really, really bad last year. So I'd be curious to see how Ryan Lewis and Isaac Yiadom compare to that.
I can tell you right
Theirs
now.
are terrible also.
Yeah. So Isaac Yiadom is a 51.1, and he's the best of these number 2 corners. Ryan Lewis is a 41, Corey Ballantyne a 38.5. By the way, Corey Ballantyne, this kind of like came up today because Corey Ballantyne was released on Tuesday. So, which is saying something because he was in a week 1 starter, and that kind of says about where they're at. But and then 2019, let's see, DeAndre Baker was a 48.4. So Yiadom is better than Baker. The others are worse, according to the PFF grades. Is how you can say that.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's wild.
It's because if you think about the Super Bowl years, like they had their cornerbacks, they were pretty good. Like they had Aaron Ross and Corey Webster in 2011. Prince Amukamara was a rookie that year, I believe. And let's see, the other year. What was the other year they won the Super Bowl?
2007.
2007, that's what I thought. All right. It's taking a while. Okay, here we go. They had, Corey Webster and Aaron Ross that year were pretty good. So, I mean, it's not like there's an overload of great cornerbacks around the NFL. You don't want to pay too much to 2 guys. You kind of need to find a young guy in the draft to be the number 2 corner usually, and so they're probably gonna have to draft one this year. I don't know how high they'll do it. Baker was supposed to be that guy, and in theory, if had come back this year and he improved, this defense would just look so much different. And it's funny, it's crazy how important the secondary is in that sense, because if you're playing good quarterbacks, which more and more teams have good quarterbacks maybe than ever, like you just can't have that big of a weak spot. They need to be league average. You don't need a Pro Bowler as your number 2 corner.
No, you got to be functional there, and the Giants have been completely dysfunctional for 17, 18, 24th years, 4 straight years now, where they've been unproductive or dysfunctional at that spot, and not coincidentally, they've been really bad now record wise for 4 straight years. So that's a huge part of today's NFL. Obviously, the quarterback position matters a ton, but cornerback is a hugely important position. And now they're not going to go out and sign another guy to a big money contract. They can't do that. They just did that with James Bradbury. I guess they could, but it wouldn't be very smart. Probably looking at having to draft a guy in the first 3 rounds next year and hope he can come in and play immediately. And it's really hard to play as a rookie cornerback, play a lot in the NFL. It's a super challenging position. So whoever comes in is going to have growing pains. There's no doubt about that. And Deandre Baker did too. So it would have been interesting to see if he would have been able to overcome any of that this year. But I think that his problems ran so deep beyond just not quite being able to put it together on the field. I think there was a lot of issues with maybe his work ethic and how much he was willing or able to grasp what was being taught. So obviously a terrible pick. We've been over it a million times, and they traded up to get him. So a brutal pick on so many levels, and one that will have ripple effects for this team for years to come.
Yeah, I would say that's the biggest concern I have, even going against the Eagles team, who is getting a lot healthier. They have Jalen Reagor. They're getting Alshon Jeffrey back. Travis Fulgham's been very good. Greg Ward's been fine. So that's going to be an issue this week if Carson Wentz is any good. I would say the biggest topic that I've noticed, just being on all the Zoom calls, we talked to position coaches on Tuesday, Joe Judge, and a couple players on Monday. A big topic has been this offensive line rotation the Giants are doing, which is something that anybody you talk to will say they've never seen anything like it. And they're playing Matt Peart as the third offensive tackle. He's playing 20 to 25 snaps a game. So they're doing different sets where Matt Peart will come in at left tackle and he'll be playing with Cam Fleming, and then Andrew Thomas will come back in, and then Cam Fleming will go out for Matt Peart, and they'll do a series together with that pairing, and then it even transferred over to left guard where Shane Lemieux came out for 3 plays in the middle of a drive for Chad Slade. And it sounds like they're going to keep going with this. It's interesting. I don't really know what to make of it. I think it's kind of an interesting way of like easing a rookie offensive lineman in that sense. I kind of get it, but at a certain point, you have to have some continuity on the offensive line, which anyone who's played offensive line would tell you that's true. You need the continuity. But what do you think of that? Because it plays into Joe Judge is always doing things differently to try and find an edge, which I guess I respect. But I don't know. I'm curious to see how this plays out the rest of the year if they keep going with it.
I mean, there's a reason teams would prefer to not do what they're doing. I mean, you would prefer to have 5 functional linemen who all play together all the time. That's what most teams do. I mean, this is not an approach that is necessarily something that's going to catch on around the NFL. Like you think about in baseball when teams have a bullpen game where like they'll throw a starter who goes 2 innings and then guys chip in for 1 and 2 and 2 and something like that. So this is not something that's going to become a trend, I don't think. I think it's more of a product of the fact that they have a flawed offensive line and they're trying to do anything they possibly can to not overwhelm the young guys that they're playing. And I think from that perspective, sure, I think you're trying to develop young guys and also trying to maximize the production to actually win games. So I guess I get it. It's not necessarily just something that's sustainable or preferable. Maybe not sustainable. Maybe it's sustainable with this group, but it's not preferable. And it's not sustainable with a group where you clearly have a starting 5. So I think looking forward, this is a group that they're going to have to figure out. Cam Fleming's a pending free agent. He's been a career backup who has played like it this season. I don't think there's in any world they should bring him back next year, unless he's going to be the backup and he's willing to be paid like it. But I think Matt Peart will be your right tackle probably, and Andrew Thomas at left tackle, unless something drastic changes or there's an injury. I think that's the way you got to go. And then they have to figure out, what do they do with Will Hernandez? Do they bring him back for the final year of his contract? And I actually overlooked and just didn't even remember him, and just remembered him now talking, is that Nate Solder will be back next year. So is Nate
Yeah.
Solder your starting right tackle, or is he your backup right tackle? He's going to be paid out the nose in this terrible contract that Dave Gettleman gave him, but because he opted out, understandably, due to, obviously being a high risk situation, opted out of this season. This season's contract numbers are bumped to next season for him. So the Giants can't cut him after this season. So he'll be back, which could be a good or a bad thing. I think he could be a fine backup, but at some point you want to get Matt Peart in there and see if he can be your right tackle of the future. And then separate from all this is, what do you do at center? Because is Nick Gates really a long-term answer? So, and will Kevin Zeitler be back? So you could go down the rabbit hole of their offensive line possibilities, but I think right now they're just trying to figure out some answers. And they're trying to, like you said, I think it's an interesting way to get the young guys' feet wet when you talk about Matt Peart, and maybe to not overwhelm Andrew Thomas and give him a break, give him a breather, give him a chance to think through these things, instead of maybe getting as overwhelmed as potentially he had been going out there. And he's really struggled. But they're obviously not going to give up on him.
Well, and the craziest part is now because Will Hernandez just got activated off the COVID-19 list, and they said they're going to ease him back in. So they're going to be running a rotation with Shane Lemieux and Will Hernandez at left guard, most likely. So that means you're going to have situations where you have 3 different spots changing throughout a game, which I can't imagine is the smartest idea. But I mean, if it works, it works. Like their running game has been better the last 2 weeks than it had been all season. Andrew Thomas has played better the last 2 weeks than he has all season, and I wonder, people have theorized whether Shane Lemieux being in there instead of Will Hernandez has something to do with that. And I mean, we'd have to talk offensive line expert if that's a real thing. I know when I covered the Eagles, like before I even covered them, actually, Jason Peters, I forget who the left guard was. There's somebody he didn't like, and so he didn't like playing next to him. And then when another player came in there, he started playing better, kind of thing. So I don't know if there's anything to that theory, but I think they really like Shane Lemieux too. But this offensive line is just such a weird Frankenstein's monster right now. And I mean, I guess that if you don't think the offensive line is good enough, then you try and do whatever you can to get at a competitive advantage, and maybe throwing the defensive line off guard is the right way to approach that. Let's see what. So I guess the other piece of news that came over the last week that we weren't able to cover in the last episode, we don't have to talk about this for too long, but they claimed Dante Pettis off waivers from the San Francisco 49ers. He's a wide receiver. He was a former 3rd-round pick. I think he was in the doghouse in San Francisco. He barely played the last 2 years, but this is the kind of stuff the Giants should be doing. They should be claiming young players on cheap contracts from other teams, seeing if they're any good. If they're not, you can get rid of them. I mean, this guy is the best punt returner I've ever seen. He had 9 touchdowns in college as a returner. He's really fast. The Giants don't really have anybody at wide receiver. They probably want to get rid of Golden Tate. Austin Mack kind of showed a little something this last game against Washington. So if you have Austin Mack and if Dante Pettis is any good, that you can cut ties with Golden Tate and get rid of that headache. This is like a smart thing for them to do, right? As a team that's not very good.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
yeah.
So Pettis is not going to be a free agent. He like you said, you kind of alluded to it, 2nd-round pick, 2018. So he'll be 18, 19, 20, 21. Next year will be the final year of his rookie contract. So the Giants get this guy and they can take a look at him, and not just have a look at him for just this season, but they say, all right, fairly affordable contract, and let's see what this guy can carry into a next season for us. At least give us a shot to get a full evaluation of him through the spring. And Golden Tate should have been gone yesterday. Should have been gone a week ago. I mean, I don't understand why this guy is still. I mean, I wrote something about this coming out.
He didn't play against Washington, by the way. I don't know if we mentioned that yet.
Yeah,
they basically suspended him essentially without officially suspending him.
Right. So I think it was so. I guess everyone listening probably knew that or understood what happened. But yeah, they did suspend him. I mean, they left him home from the trip because of all the nonsense from last week with demanding the ball, and it's just the latest thing with this guy after the PED suspension, after the fight with Jalen Ramsey, and now this issue with demanding the ball. And I'm not even going to mention. I mean, what his wife put on social media, whatever. I mean, it's not like he's at fault for that. It's not like he wrote that and said, "Hey, put this up." I can't imagine that was the case, but um, these issues that keep popping up for a guy who's not worth the trouble in the NFL. You're worth the trouble until you no longer are, and he is no longer worth the trouble. I mean, the Giants could save $3.75 million against the cap and roll it into next year by cutting this guy, but Dave Gettleman's not going to do it because he gave Golden Tate $22.95 million guaranteed at the time of his signing, and now this year's salary guarantee was wiped out by last year's PED suspension, but he's surely a goner after this year. The problem is they're still going to have to eat, I think, $4.7 million in dead cap because his signing bonus proration, and he got a $10 million signing bonus. It was a terrible contract. Just cut your losses and move on. It was a really bad contract, one of many that this failed GM has given out, and I just don't see what the point is anymore in keeping him around, because take a look at Austin Mack, take a look at Dante Pettis, and get a look at some of these young players. Get some more targets for Darius Slayton. And obviously Sterling Shepard probably will be back next year. You kind of know what you have in him. But there's many reasons why Golden Tate should be a goner. But the problem is, the guy who makes that decision has an obviously interest in making the Tate signing look as good as possible. Yeah, objectively, he doesn't really bring much to the team anymore, and he has no future with the team. The team's 2-7. You should be thinking about the future. You shouldn't be thinking about, and the offense can be competent without him, I think, even though they had their issues in Washington yet again. It's not like they're going to be that much better with him on the field, right?
I mean, they aren't good with him on the field already. So, right. I mean, he only played 50% of the snaps in that game where he was complaining on top of that. And if you think you have something in Austin Mack, you absolutely should be playing him more. And if you think you want to see what Dante Pettis has, then Golden Tate might be playing less than 50% of the snaps against the Eagles. So, yeah, that kind of goes in. And this is a good way to spin to the next topic I want to do, and we can kind of wrap up on, is the idea that they're in the NFC East race is probably playing into their decision a little bit to not get rid of Tate yet, because in theory that, maybe to the fan base, if you cut Golden Tate, by the way, the fan base doesn't seem to want Golden Tate on the team anymore anyway. If they cut him, then maybe it looks like you're giving up on the year. But, if they lose to the Eagles on Sunday, all those hopes of winning the division just kind of officially go out the window. And it's kind of, insane that we're even talking like a 2-7 team can get into the race anyway.
I think people are just looking at the
numbers,
obviously.
Yeah.
Well, I mean the
math.
Division where the division leaders 3-4-1, and then the Washington's 2-6, and then the Cowboys 2-7. The Giants are 2-7. So the Giants are only a win out of first place. Well, not really. They're 1.5 wins out of first place because the Eagles really have 3.5 wins if you actually look at it, because they have a tie. So there's so many things that are going to need to break the Giants' way. The Washington quarterback situation, the Dallas quarterback situation, almost you'd think would disqualify them from being contenders. I guess you never know. The Eagles are clearly, this division is there for the taking. Honestly, you could make the case that if the Eagles don't win the division and make the playoffs this year, that Doug Peterson might be fired, or that maybe he should be. It's a conversation, right? I mean, they don't have the excuses that all these other teams have. They're more talented than the Giants, and they have an upright quarterback, unlike the Washington and the Cowboys. So, yeah, I mean, so do you say what the Giants are going to win the division at 6-10, which still means they would have to close 4-3, which is not easy for a team that is, number one, not very good. And they still have to play what? Eagles, Bengals, Seahawks, Cardinals, Browns, Ravens.
So if they want a shot, they have to win the next 2 games in a row, which would be a 3-game winning streak, which they haven't done in who knows how long. And then after that, the schedule goes at Seattle versus Arizona versus Cleveland, at Baltimore, and then you end in Dallas. Like that 4-game stretch, they're going to be probably heavy underdogs in all 4. Yes. Maybe not the Browns. I mean, the Browns have like a 6-2 record even without Beckham. So those are 4 playoff teams most likely. And
5-3, yeah.
Teams with a lot of like weapons on offense and interesting guys. Like the Giants, the odds of them winning, so if they win 2 more games, these next 2 games, they'd have 4 wins. And to get to 6 wins, you have to win at least one of those 4. I mean, it's possible, I guess. Like that's like we're playing in scenarios where the Giants only barely beat Washington twice, and those are their only wins. Like the odds of them winning 6 games are pretty slim. If they did it, then Joe Judge is the guy and give him a lifetime contract. So,
But you also have to think like, oh yeah, they're going to win the division at 6-10, but only if the other teams in the division also continue to lose.
Yeah.
So like you have to like bank on the Eagles just going completely in the tank. Like if you say, oh, the Giants are going to win the division at 6-10, all right, well then that means the Eagles have to.
Yeah, they have to have a better. They can. They're not going to tie. They're not going to tie the Eagles' record because the Eagles have a tie. So
right, so that means the Eagles have to win 5 games, right? To be 5.5 wins. So that means the Eagles have to only have.
Eagles have to go. They have
the
to
rest
go
of the season.
Yep. They have to go 2-6 the rest of the way, and so the Eagles play. The Eagles coming up play the Giants, Browns. So their schedule's pretty hard too. They have Seahawks, Green Bay, New Orleans, Arizona, but they end with Dallas and Washington, which are 2 games the Eagles should be able to win, and then that kind of clinches the division for them. So.
I still think the Eagles have to be the odds-on favorite to win the division at this point. And yes, I mean, I understand the mathematically being in it. And of course, these guys are competitors. Joe Judge is a competitor. They're going to want to try to win the division. They're going to try to do everything they possibly can, keep all the guys on the roster who they can, whatever. But look, I guess in the grand scheme of things, saving $3.75 million against the cap and getting rid of Golden Tate and maybe getting a little bit more of a look at the young receivers versus balancing out, trying to win, which, matters to these guys a lot, even though this is a rebuilding team. I guess I can understand why they would keep a guy like that around. But yeah, big picture, I would expect the Eagles to win this game on Sunday and to kind of set aside finally once and for all those kind of pipe dream hopes of NFC East title for the Giants.
Yeah, and just to put a bow on this with the Eagles-Giants game, it's important to remember the last time they played, the Giants were up 21-10 late in the fourth quarter and lost it, which has been like a frequent thing against the Eagles. So they're clearly capable of beating this Eagles team, but the Eagles are also going to have a healthy Lane Johnson, Jason Peters is back, Miles Sanders, Jalen Reagor, Alshon Jeffrey, Vontae Maddox. I think they might even have somebody, Will Parks. So like they're almost a different team than the last time they played, and the Eagles are coming off a bye, and they're usually good off byes. So it's going to be a harder one to win, even though it's at home for the Giants. I haven't picked a score yet. I think it'll be a close one again, and I probably will pick something like the Eagles winning 24-17, something like that. I think that the Giants their defense can still stop Carson Wentz, who's prone to turnovers. And if they force a bunch, is how they get it up. Like, I wouldn't be shocked if they upset the Eagles, but I would be surprised, is what I would say.
Yes, I think that's fair. And I sent my pick earlier today to our email group, and I picked Eagles 24, Giants 21. And that would mean the Giants would be 8-42 against non-Washington opponents since the start of 2017. So, 24-21 Eagles. I don't know what the line is in this game, but I would imagine that if you're betting it, that's probably more than 3 for the Eagles. So that would be a win in that department at least. But yeah, I think the Giants showed in their first meeting in week 7 that they can play with this team. But like you said, it's a completely different team than that team. Looks like the line's 3.5. So there you go. I think the Eagles in that situation, they would barely not cover. So, So I think, 24-21 seems reasonable. The Giants are not a team that's going to score a ton of points, but they showed that they could put together a pretty good half against a more than decent Washington defense last week. And it's a matter of that their offense did nothing in the second half, the Giants. And maybe not only does Daniel Jones need to play a turnover-free game for them to be in contention in this game, but they need to put together a more complete game overall on offense. They can't just play a half like they did in Washington. And maybe they have a shot. In that case, maybe they have a shot.
Yeah, I would say they have a shot would be the best way of putting this. But yeah, I wouldn't predict the Giants winning this game. We'll wrap it up on that note. Thank you guys for listening. We got some reviews this last week. We're a little out of time here. Maybe I'll read them on our next episode. But thank you for writing those. Write some more. As always, follow us. Subscribe to the podcast. We're on all the major apps. And sign up for our text service, NJ.com/text. And we'll see you guys next week.
Did you know that with Drizzly, you can get drinks delivered to your door in under 60 minutes? Yep, With Drizzly, the #1 alcohol delivery app, you can shop a huge selection of beer, wine, and liquor, including favorites like Don Julio and Bullet Bourbon. Plus, you can shop across multiple stores in your area to find what you want at the best prices. Download the app or visit drizzly.com. That's DRIZLY and use code SAVE to save $5 on your first order today.